Javier. Thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, to be the starting act for speed dating at the playground. My wife is a divorce attorney. I told her I was coming here, and she said, don't bother coming home. So anyway, I'm very pleased to be here. Tucson is I came here in 1983, and of course, everybody that's in this room probably has a sense that I have of Tucson as an amazing community to live in. And recently, downtown has become what I always thought downtown should be. That's wonderful. But that doesn't change the fact that there are folks like all of you that really are the heart of Tucson. So I want to describe today a little bit of what, through the College of Science, we've been envisioning for geotourism, trying to help people like all of you give the word out of the sense of place that we actually live in, and what an amazing place this is all about. Tucson is genuine. Tucson has a natural history like almost nowhere else. And we should be so proud of the place that we live in that through some of the pictures that I'll show you today, I'll try to construct the construct that we've been thinking about for many years now. So the title of my talk is Geotourism. And geotourism came from stealing an idea from a few faculty members in the College of Science that used to have a course called Sense of Place. The course was driven by a geologist and an ecologist, and they used to take high school and middle school teachers and take them to field trips throughout a semester to show the incredible beauty and the incredible natural history that we live in. When I saw what they did, I basically then said, well, you know, we should actually have a sense of place trip for people with a lot of money and see if we can show them what an amazing place this is, and drive up the Catalina Mountains and describe really the extraordinary area that we live in. So to give you sort of an idea of how all this began, we have in the College of Science a trip that we organize with a geologist, an ecologist, a tree ring specialist, and an astronomer. And we drive up the Catalina Mountains, and it's going from 2,000 feet elevation to 10,000 feet elevation, which if you're an aficionado of driving in the roads, it's like driving from here to Vancouver, okay? Because you start down with a desert, and you end up at the top with conifer forests. As you drive up the Catalina Mountains, you can actually see on the rocks the evolution of the Southwest. You can see how the Tucson Mountains slid off the Catalina Mountains to where they are now, how the Tucson Basin was developed, how the water in the Tucson Basin is developed. You keep on driving up and you look at, if you're with a tree ring specialist, you can actually describe the fire history of the Catalina Mountains, which represent the fire history of the Southwest, which are sort of, you know, you have a lot of little fires forever, and then all of a sudden those fires end at the same time as Smokey the Bear shows up. And then there are no fires. And then the fires that we have today are extraordinary fires, fires that cannot be controlled. And those fires are the result of all of the biomes that are created through not having enough fires in the past. So you have all this fuel that actually gets generated, and you have these fires that are what you see today. You keep on driving up, and you see the same thing that the scientists of Tuamac Hill 100 years ago discovered, which are these life zones, right? And how you, as you go up the Catalina Mountains, you can see different flora and fauna. Modern ecology was invented in Tucson, by the way, by these folks driving up the Catalina, walking up the Catalina Mountains. and living in Tillamook Hill, and ending up at the very top with the largest telescope around with an eyepiece. And there's nothing as cool as seeing astronomical objects through an eyepiece instead of a television screen. That then was sort of the beginning of the idea that Tucson was a very, very special place. If you look at Tucson, Tucson has two things, natural history going for it, and that is the topography that we see, and you have all these mountains that are disconnected one from each other. The Catalina Mountains, Santa Rita's, Rincon Mountains. Each one of these represent the equivalent of an island in an ocean of desert. They're all disconnected from each other. They all have different evolutionary histories from each other because there's no way that all of the fauna and the flora can go from each one to each one. And to give you an idea of the extraordinary biodiversity that we have, simply because of the topography, in the Catalina Mountains we have 5,000 species of flowers. If you go east of the Mississippi, you have 4,000 species of flowers in all of the East Coast. That's just one mountain range. You go to different mountain ranges and they have different species. You have to each one of these different mountain ranges, they have different lizards, they have different everything because they've been disconnected from each other for about 15 million years. That's number one. Number two, and this of course the birders have known forever, that if you look at Tucson happens to be at a place where fauna from the Sierra Madre makes it about as far north as here, and fauna from the Rocky Mountains make it about as far south as here. So you have a confluence. You have a confluence of fauna that is almost unique to anywhere else because we just happen to be in the right geography. So between the geography and between the topography, we are in an incredibly special place. Now on top of that, and then I'm going to go into my slides, on top of that, as everybody knows in this room, the archaeology and the history of this place is really incredible. So what does all that represent? It represents a unique opportunity of taking what is not an invention, what is truly us, and be very proud of what we are and try to sell it elsewhere to show other folks around the world of what a unique place this is. I went to the Ventana Medical. I think everybody here knows Ventana Medical. You know, it's in Oro Valley. It's a big deal pharmaceutical entity. It belongs to Roche, and Roche is a Swiss place. And we need to show these folks, these Swiss folks, that when they're moved from Zurich to Tucson, they're not coming to the end of the world. They're coming to a very special place in the world. That kind of symbolism and that kind of a dialogue can be incredibly powerful. What we're trying to do through this geotourism thing, because I call it a thing at the moment, is that when you fly into Tucson and you get into a taxi, the taxi driver says, "You've showed up in one of the most amazing places in the world." And let me talk a little bit about it. Okay? That's what we're trying to do. All right, so this works. We'll have a presentation. Okay, so this is all about geotourism. Why UA science? I told you the history of UA science. It clearly is way more than UA science. It started as a recognition that we have more biodiversity in southern Arizona than anywhere else in the United States. So we're like the Galapagos in the United States, and we're not taking advantage of that sense. But it's way more than that. So what is it about this place? Well, everybody here loves this place. That's why you're here. So I'm sort of speaking to the choir, so I'm trying to give you some words that you may want to use elsewhere. But this place is extraordinary. Here is the Saguaro National Forest. And even though the saguaros originated in Oaxaca, that's where the biodiversity comes from. If you ever see a movie that has saguaros, it's us. Right? So just remind that to everybody that's watching any movie anywhere, that there's a saguaro, it's not in Texas. But the biodiversity that we have is truly extraordinary. And why here? Because I think that we have the right community and we have the right product. I hate to use the term, but we really do have the right environment. That if we all sort of focus in the same direction and we all have the sense of place of where we live, that will increase the worth of the place that we're at for people that are interested in moving here as well. So we created this as an economic development kind of thing, but in the end, you really cannot have economic development if the people that are living in the community aren't as proud of the community as it can be. I lived in Miami before I came here, and I remember when Miami was sort of Medicare by the sea, you know, and that was sort of the message. And there were a couple of women that decided that they wanted to save Art Deco District, which is now south of Miami. And they put all their efforts into saving the Art Deco District. And why did they want to do that? Because it was a genuine part of Miami. Again, it wasn't like Disneyland. They were just trying to save an important part of the history of Miami. Well, they were successful in that, and of course, you can see what Miami is today. Now, some of you may think it's nuts, but in the end, my brother lives in Miami. He says that the best thing in Miami is that it's close to the U.S. In some ways, we could think of Tucson the same way. And we should think that as sort of like a tagline. Okay. And what is geotourism? Geotourism is taking advantage of the genuine parts of the place that you live to try to bring tourism to take part of that. So geotourism is sort of a part of ecotourism. If you go to Costa Rica, they talk about ecotourism because it's all about the ecology. But geotourism is more than that. It takes into account the natural history as well as the history of the archaeology. And there's no place in this country that has a richer history than we do. So you can read this as well as I can. It creates a synergistic tourism environment. That's good for all of us because basically there's the way that Chocolate Berry, who's a good friend of all of this, funds a lot of stuff is by the tax that comes from beds, right? So you basically have a lot of tourism. You have a possibility of doing way more than you have otherwise. It engages public and private communities, and we already have that downtown through the efforts of the Osrons with the Congress Hotel and what Fletcher McCusker has been trying to do, and many other entities. I think that the reason that our downtown is as rich as it is now is because, in fact, the private industry has gotten in it, and it's the private-public partnerships that allow these things to happen. Government cannot do it on its own, private industry cannot do it on its own, but it's the partnership and the honest partnership that actually allows these things to happen. Now, if you look at what I'm trying to talk about, and I'm just going to let all these little things come up there, and if you think about this in a holistic kind of way, you can see that we have a bunch of stuff that we should be incredibly proud of. Let me start with Tucson Hill. I'm not sure this is working. Well, Tucson Hill, which everybody knows where it is. Tucson Hill started about 100 years ago, and a partnership between the Carnegie Institution of Washington and and Tucson. And what Carnegie Institution wanted to do at that time is create an environment that would allow us to understand what happens to the desert when a city is overcrowded. Okay? And at that time, 100 years ago, there was cattle, there was all kinds of stuff eating Tumamoc Hill, and they did a very simple experiment. They put a fence around Tumamoc Hill so that cattle could not actually eat more of the stuff. And I don't know how many of you walk up Tumamoc Hill, but if you walk up Tumamoc Hill and you compare Tumamoc Hill to Sentinel Peak, it's like two different planets. And the only reason it's two different planets is because basically we protected Tumamoc Hill. It's sort of as simple as that. All right. So they developed the Desert Museum, and researchers from the Desert Museum went up and down the Catalina Mountains and invented modern ecology. So these are deep roots of what I'm talking about. But in addition to that, we have the Desert Museum, which is a man-made operation. We have Biosphere, which is a man-made operation. We have Kidd Peak, which is a man-made operation. And then we have things that are not, like Sabino Canyon, like going up and down the Catalina Mountains, Kashmir Caverns. So the combination of things that have been created by mankind and the combination of things that are natural to our environment really have put together an ecosystem that's amazing. 3 years or 4 years ago, I started with this kind of message, and this year has been sort of an amazing year because there's been an approval from Pima County to put in their bond initiative a portal to this environment, which is going to go and sit in Rio Nuevo. So there's going to be a visitor center which is going to try to embody what I'm talking about. At that visitor center, we get it right. If we get it wrong, it's going to be boring. So there's still a lot of ways to go. But if we get it right, it would be not only a place where all of us can go to as often as we want to try to understand what the concept is about, or a living visitor center, but also tourists who come in there and sort of decide where to go from there. All right? So that's happening now. So again, going into the private-public partnerships, the public partnership is that there's going to be a bond issue for $20 million, or 10, I can't remember the number of dollars, for putting together a visitor center in Rio Nuevo. And that visitor center is going to embody this lecture in a much better way than I'm trying to give it. It would be all of the entities and all of the pieces that make geotourism represented there so people can come and go. Okay, so this is a cartoon that shows that, the geotourism portal. When I first started with the idea of having a visitor center, I thought that the visitor center should be in Tumamoc Hill, which in many ways is the birthplace of Tucson. Tumamoc Hill has archaeology at the top of it that's about 3,000 years old. It's some of the oldest public architecture in the Southwest. And of course, it's an ecological preserve where some of the longest lived plots have been studied forever. And it has history, and I don't know how many of you are really from Tucson, but many of now the famous names that you hear in Tucson, like the Longs and whatnot, their grandparents started in a tent in Tumamoc Hill, building those buildings that are up there. So the history of Tumamoc Hill is amazing. I'm glad that it reports to me, the College of Science. But in the end, I took Fletcher. I don't know how many of you know Fletcher McCusker. He was one of my heroes. I took him up there. He is one of those folks that is basically driving what Tucson is going to be in the future. And I took him up there. He's a Tucsonian, and he's never been there. I don't know how many of you have not been there. So anyway, I take him up there, and he's just mesmerized by the whole place. And the first thing they tell me is that I'm an idiot, because there's no way there could be a visitor center in Tumamoc Hill. There's no parking. You know, I don't think about these things. There's no parking. There's no way of getting up there without killing 3 people on the way out. So he's the one that says we should do that at Rio Nuevo. And he then implements my fuzzy idea and connects the state parks, Rio Nuevo, Pima County to create this thing that may be, if we do it right, sort of the centerpiece of the vision of geotourism. And the rest of my story is simply just that we need to have these kinds of partnerships to create and to make this vision a reality, and not just basically some foggy thing that I have in my mind because I've driven up Mount Lemmon 15 times last week. So if you look at what we've been trying to do, the partnerships, we can start with natural history. And my vision started with biodiversity. And which are the partners that we have to put together so that biodiversity is properly represented? Well, here are some of them. The Arizona Desert Museum, which really represents biodiversity in our community. In fact, the Arizona Desert Museum can be bottled and actually exported to represent this whole idea. Sabino Canyon is part of that. Saguaro National Park is part of that. And even the Tucson Botanical Gardens are part of that. Tohono Chulu is part of that. These entities should be working together to try to create a uniform view of biodiversity for our community and then selling it to the National Geographic, as an example. Geology. We have amazing geology here. And thank God that we don't have a lot of plants. That's why our geology is so great, because we can see the rocks. I'm a geologist, by the way. But the geology that's represented in, for example, Catalina Mountains and Sabino Canyon represent through the rocks, and we can show it to anybody that wants to drive up with us. We can show it in the textures and in the fabrics of the rocks, the history of the Southwest for the last 100 million years. Not a lot of places can do that. It's truly extraordinary. And not only do we have the sort of the material to do that, we have faculty members at the University of Arizona, the heroes that actually have figured out this geology that can be used in a proper way by all of us to represent Tucson. Of course, astronomy, I don't have to say much more about astronomy. We have more telescopes under the College of Science than any university anywhere. And one of those telescopes happens to be, for example, at the top of Mount Lemmon. And if you ever go up to Mount Lemmon and you go to what's called the Mount Lemmon Science Center, there's a gentleman up there, his name is Adam Block. You can go. You can basically be astronomer for the night. And Adam Block could easily work for Walt Disney. He is so good with the public. And he also gets, every year, he gets some kind of award from NASA for taking the most extraordinary photographs of the cosmos that are around. So there's another individual and another thing that we should be amazingly proud of and try to connect it to the fabric of what Tucson is all about. So Kid Peak, Flandrown, which is, has a telescope in there and has now a new show through digital equipment, Mount Lemmon Science Center. All these people should again be thinking about a holistic program that brings in more, that basically gives us pride, but also brings in more tourism through that. Ecology. Well, I've already mentioned ecology, but in ecology we also, in addition to the Desert Museum at Tillamook Hill, which I've already mentioned 20 times, is a biosphere too. Now, I'm the director of Biosphere 2, and the joke that I always keep telling people is that I feel like the seventh husband of Elizabeth Taylor. Because Biosphere has had a complex history, but it's real sexy. And I don't mind being married to Biosphere 2, or, if it stays, to Elizabeth Taylor. But the bottom line is that Biosphere 2 is recognized by Time Life magazine as one of the 50 man-made wonders of the world. That's not an invention that we, as PR, are doing from Tucson or the U of A. It is what it is. It was invented, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s. It was so visionary. In those days, it was, we're going to need something like the Biosphere 2 and the moon if we're going to be able to visit Mars. It has to do with how space travel goes and whatnot. So think about it as a Texaco of the moon, a big Texaco sun. Of course, now we use the Biosphere 2 as the largest, most complex apparatus to study global climate change. There is no other place in the world that has the scale of the Biosphere 2 to study the issues that affect us through global climate change. That's part of these ecosystems. You know, we don't have to build this thing. We couldn't build this thing if we actually had all the money in the world these days. What else? Conservation. Tree ring lab. The tree ring was invented at the University of Arizona. Tree ring research was invented by an astronomer that didn't know what he was doing because he thought he could figure through the tree rings how the sun worked. But in the end, like most science, failed experiments are the most important experiments because they teach you stuff. And tree ring then became the tool to try to understand archaeology in the Southwest. And now it has become the tool to understand global climate change. So there you go. So people can show up at the tree ring lab and they can see all this wood that has been collected from everywhere, understand what that's all about, and learn about conservation. Environment. We care about our environment more than anybody else. One of the two things that I can say about why we care about our environment, well, we got rid of grass in most places, which is not necessarily the best thing to do, but we got rid of grass because at that point they told us that that was a good thing to do. In the end, we sterilized the environment, and now we're trying to come back and say, well, you know, if we really put rocks everywhere, it may be okay for water, but it's not really okay for biodiversity. So now we're trying to re-educate people about what that's all about. But the important thing is that if you look at the amount of water that we use as an example, per person, compared to anywhere else in the U.S., including you know, LA and Phoenix and whatnot and Las Vegas, we use less than anybody else. Why? Because we care about our environment. If you look at how we try to connect, you know, species that are dying or not dying, we may sometimes not get it quite right, but we all are really interested in it. One of the things that I try to do as dean of the College of Science is bring in educational programs to our community. I am a firm believer that the university has to be embedded in the community, has to educate the community, because if we're going to have a true working democracy, we have to be educated. And a lot of the stuff that we're all rattling around in our head is science. I remember not too long ago when there was a big debate, I don't know how many of you were still around, there was a big debate as to whether we should be using our groundwater or CAP water. And the people that were driving that argument were two car dealers. Which, you know, I'm not exactly sure why they were driving the argument, because it was, you know, it was truly they were trying to do the right thing. But I would argue that they probably didn't know much about water. So our university has, it's important for us to educate the community about the things that we learn as we learn them. All right? So environment, I think we live in a community where that's a given. But then, sustainability is part of it. So I'm not going to go more into that. I think everybody in this room understands sustainability. And in the end, if we don't have sustainability, we're screwed. But then in addition to that, and this has been sort of the epiphany in my mind, is all of the other incredible stuff that is represented in our community. And the other incredible stuff is our Hispanic culture. I came from Mexico City, so in some ways, the Hispanics of Northwest Mexico and Tucson see me as a foreigner, because my culture is in some ways slightly different. But the Hispanic culture of here is so rich. It's some of the richest in the United States. History of this place is incredibly rich. Our native culture is incredibly rich. And I have here Mission Garden, Self Culture Center, San Javier del Back. Again, we have to find ways for these entities that so purely represent these particular segments that I'm putting up here to work with each other to create an ecosystem. You can just imagine an ecosystem that in the end produce the sense of place that we're trying to produce. And archaeology. I've already mentioned that in Papatumamakeo is some of the richest archaeology that we have in the Southwest. One of the things that we've done in partnership with Visit Tucson, the Desert Museum, the Park Service, is we got a little bit of money to create a website. And this website is called See Tucson. And basically it just promotes awareness of who we are by letting you all put your pictures in the website. Okay? It's called Tucson.org, and the way that it works is you have all these pictures that have been taken by all of you that are put up there, and sooner or later we'll have a reference site that will be unlike any other reference site in the U.S. I urge you all to go to ctucson.org, and you'll see the photographs that are there, and I hope to see the photographs. Michael McNulty, you can put some of these photographs up there as well. So, VOA Science, this is now an ad for what I run. We see ourselves as trying to sort of drive a conversation. That conversation is minimized if it's only science, but the conversation has to be done by all of us. And I hope that this just sort of gives you a sense of what an amazing place we live in. Thanks so much.